For this lesson, we're going to be looking at solving quadratic relations. And when we solve quadratic relations, we will need our equations in factored form. So we're going to go back and review a few things that we've done before. So our question is, if x equals 2 and x equals 4 are my zeros and my vertex is 3, -2, what would be the equation in vertex form, standard form, and factored form? So going back to last unit, we'll start by finding our equation in vertex form. So we're given that x equals 2 and x equals 4 are my zeros. These zeros give us the points 2, 0 and 4, 0. So we are given our vertex and a point, just like we were before. So we have our vertex at 3, -2, and we have a point at 2, 0. It doesn't matter which point you pick because they're both on the parabola. Now, we're trying to fill in y equals a x minus h all squared plus k. So we start by plugging in our vertex. As a reminder, our vertex gives us h and k, so we can sub those in. Next, we're going to sub in our point so that we only have one variable remaining. So let's sub in 0 for y and 2 for x. Now we're going to solve for a, so let's simplify inside that bracket. Now the exponent, -1 squared is just 1, so we said a minus 2. And then to get a all by itself, that 2 comes over here. So now we know our equation in vertex form is 2. We sub in our vertex again for h and k. So that's our first one. Next, we're going to find it in factored form. I'm going a little out of order here. That'll make our math easier later. So we are trying to find our equation in factored form. So we are given our zeros here. And we're trying to fill all of our information into our factored form equation, which is a equals x minus r, x minus s, where r and s are our zeros. So we can start by subbing those in. And now we need to solve for a. But if I look here, I have way too many variables. So just like above, I need an extra point to sub in. And I can't sub in the zeros again because we've already used them. But what I can sub in is my other point, which is my vertex. So similar to above, I'm just going to sub in 3 and -2 for my x and y. Now I'm just going to simplify those brackets. And then do my multiplication. So we have -a, and then we'll get a all by itself by dividing out that -1. So now we can write it all out. So our equation is y equals 2 x minus 2, x minus 4. So now we've written our equation in vertex form and in factored form. And now we want to write it in standard form. And in order to write it in standard form, I'm just going to expand and simplify either my equation in vertex form or factored form. Your equation is a little bit easier to multiply out in standard form, but it doesn't matter if you want to multiply it out from vertex form, that's absolutely okay too. So all I'm going to do is draw my arrows here and multiply out those brackets. So we'll have x squared minus 4x minus 2x plus 8 We'll collect some like terms. There we go. And then we'll multiply in that 2. So we're left with y equals 2x squared minus 12x plus 16. So now we have our equation written in 3 different ways. We have vertex form, we have factored form, and we have standard form. If you were to put all of these in Desmos, you would end up with the exact same graph as long as you did all your math right. Now, the last way I can model my quadratic relation is for me to graph it, and you can graph it however you want. Really, you just need 3 points. So because we've been given our zeros at 2 and 4, and our vertex at 3, -2, that is enough for us to graph it. So now I can just connect those into a nice parabola shape like that. So we have these 3 different ways of writing the equation and our graph, and each of these are useful in their own right. So we're going to go through each of them briefly and talk about some of the benefits of each form. So the first one with standard form is I can find my a value. So that tells me my step pattern, if it is a happy parabola, if it's a sad parabola. It tells me if it's been stretched or compressed. So that's always very useful to see. The next thing it does show me is my little c here. We talked about this briefly a while ago, but this little c is my y-intercept. So if I want to see my y-intercept really quick, standard form is very beneficial. Next, we have our vertex form. So vertex form is really useful because I can also see my a value here. And again, my a value will tell me if it is a happy parabola, if it's a sad parabola, if it's been stretched or compressed. So it's very useful. So again, I can see my a value, which is awesome. Next, I have this h and k here. And those two show me my vertex. So if I want to know what the maximum or minimum is, knowing my vertex is very important, so vertex form would probably be your go-to. Finally, we have factored form, and factored form also shows us our a value, and they're always the same a value. And then it also gives us this r and s, which are our zeros / x-intercepts. And very often we will want to find out where it hits 0. So if I'm looking at a rocket hitting the ground, something like that, factored form becomes very, very useful. So because all 3 of these forms have their benefits, it's important that we know how to switch between them. So for standard form, if I want to get to factored form, I can just factor my equation. That's all I have to do is just factor it, just like we were doing in Unit 4. And we did a little bit of it yesterday in order to find factored form, but all I have to do is factor my equation. Now, if I want to go from factored form back to standard form, I'm just going to multiply out those brackets just like we did above. So we're going to expand. That's what we call it when we do the arrows and we multiply out the brackets. And then we simplify. And that means that we'll just collect any like terms that we have. Next, if I want to go from standard form to vertex form, it's been a while since we've talked about this, we are going to complete the square. So that was from last unit, and that's what we were doing when we found that magic number and we added and subtracted it in the brackets. So that's how I go from standard form to vertex form. And then if I want to go from vertex form to standard form, I'm just going to multiply out that bracket and expand it all and simplify again. So again, I just expand, and simplify. Now, you're probably noticing going from vertex form to factored form. There's no real direct way to go from vertex form to factored form or factored form to vertex form. So usually if you want to go from vertex to factored or factored to vertex, you have to go through standard form. So now what we're going to get into is we're going to look at quadratic equations. So we've talked about quadratic relations, but when something becomes an equation is when it's equal to a number. And these quadratic equations we can actually solve. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be solving by factoring. And what we'll start to do is I'll show you how you can actually solve these things nice and easily. So when we get to these word problems, we can find answers without having to use Desmos and clicking on the graph. So what we're going to do here is we're going to solve this by factoring. And we did this a little bit before by finding the zeros, so it's not totally new. So right now I have x squared minus 16 equals 0. So when I'm going to solve by factoring, it's very similar to finding the zeros. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor my equation. And if I look here, I have a difference of squares. So I can jump right to x plus 4, x minus 4 equals 0. And now, just like before, I'm just going to set both those brackets equal to 0. And solve for our x. So we have x equals negative 4 and x equals 4. So exactly the same steps as we were using when we were finding the zeros, but this is just our value for x. So it's not necessarily the zeros. In this case it is, but you'll see some where it's not. Let's try another one. So for this one, we have 2x squared minus 8 equals 0. So I'm going to solve for x. So the first thing I want to do is factor. So I look through here and see if there's anything I can common factor. So I can common factor out a 2x. I'm left with x minus 4. And now I can set both of those equal to 0. So we'll have 2x equals 0 and x minus 4 equals 0. And now I can just solve for those x's. And those are our two answers. So we'll try a few more. For C, we have x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 0. So the first thing I do is I'm going to see if I can factor this. So I check to see if I can common factor anything out. In this case, I can't. So now I can start factoring it. So I'm looking for two numbers that add to my middle number and two numbers that multiply to my last number. And then that will give me negative 4 and negative 4 and negative 4 and negative 4. Since my a value is 1, I can jump right to the brackets. And then I just set my brackets equal to 0. So because I got the same answer twice, it just means there's only one answer for x, and that's absolutely okay. Next one here. I first start by seeing if there's anything I can common factor. I can't, so now I can factor this. So I need two numbers that add to my middle number and two numbers that multiply to a times c. So now if I think of my two numbers, I'm going to have negative 2 and negative 2, and negative 2, negative 2. So we'll write those in. Instead of writing that negative 4, we're going to write negative 2x, negative 2x. Now we just factor by grouping. So we'll common factor as much as we can out of both of those groups. And then we'll take those matching brackets out. And then once we have it all factored, we just set our brackets equal to 0. So that first one gives us x equals 1/2. And then we'll do it again over here, and we'll also get x equals 1/2. So again, there's only one answer, and that's okay. So we'll do 2 more quick examples. This next one here, we have 3x squared minus 2 equals negative 7x plus 4. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get everything on one side. If you've noticed with all our other ones, they were all equal to 0. And this whole process only works if it's equal to 0. So let's start by moving everything over to one side. So once we move everything over to one side, I'm just going to collect some like terms here. So I just want to make sure that I've collected all of my like terms and all of our terms are in the right order. So we always want to have x squared, then x, and then no variables. And now we're all set to start the solving process. So I first look to see if there's anything I can common factor. And in this case, there is not. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find 2 numbers that add to my middle number, which is 7, and 2 numbers that multiply to 3 times negative 6, which is negative 18. And those 2 numbers will be 9 and negative 2, 9 and negative 2. So because they add to 7, instead of writing 7x here, I can do plus 9x and minus 2x. And now I can factor by grouping. So I factor out as much as I can out of the first group, which will be 3x, and I'm left with x plus 3. And then I do the same with the next one. So I can factor out negative 2, I'm left with x plus 3. And I get matching brackets, which is a really good sign. So I can take out those matching brackets. I'm left with 3x minus 2. Now, just like before, I can set these both equal to 0. So I'll have x plus 3 equals 0, and 3x minus 2 equals 0. And now I can just solve for those x's. So I'll have x equals negative 3. And over here, we have 3x equals 2, and x equals 2 over 3. So we have 2 answers that would make this expression true. Okay, one last example. So for this one here, we have 4x all multiplied by x plus 1, and that is equal to 9 plus 4x. So the first thing we want to do is we're just going to multiply anything out that we can. So let's multiply in this 4x. Next, we're going to move everything over so that this all equals 0. And then we're just going to collect some like terms. So now I have 4x squared minus 9 equals 0. So now that I have it all equaling 0, I'm ready to start factoring. So I first always start by looking to see if I can common factor. In this case, I cannot. So I will just factor normally. So I have 4x squared minus 9, and that's a difference of squares. So that will give me 2x plus 3 and 2x minus 3 equals 0. And then I can just set those both equal to 0. So our two answers will be negative 3 over 2 and 3 over 2. So the next thing that you'll want to do is there are a few practice things down here. So what I want you to start by practicing is converting things from standard form to factored form, stating the x-intercepts in the vertex, and then going from vertex form. Remember that when we're finding the vertex, if we have our zeros, you can just find the point right in between. So you can go through those quickly, and then there are a few practice problems for you to try down here.